Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, Weeb Union, and in this one we start out in the direction of Krasnohorivka, where the Russians have managed to reach the northwestern outskirts of the city. The Ukrainians are now completely pushed to the corner. There's no Ukrainian presence in the central, northeastern, or western parts of the city. It is now entirely in the northwestern outskirts. The Ukrainians currently have two positions. The first one is to the north of this marshland that is north of Krasnohorivka, and then there's the second position along the northwestern outskirts all the way to the reservoir west of the city. So with this, we see that the Russians have now completely pushed out the Ukrainians to the northern outskirts of the city. Taking a look at the topographic map, we see that there is no significant advantage to either side. The city itself is located at a height of about 150 meters, and the area the Ukrainians are still holding on to is slightly below at an elevation difference of about 10 meters in favor of the Russians. And at the same time, the Ukrainians do not really have any significant defensive positions here in the northwestern parts of the city. This entire area only has one mapped out fortified position. There could be more newly built fortified positions, likely along the western parts of the city at the outside. There's this small area here, there's likely fortified positions there, and along the forest lines here to the south and west of Krasnohorivka. But there is no major fortified positions, there's no major outposts, there's nothing that is of significance outside the city of Krasnohorivka itself. Therefore, it is likely that following the capture of the city, the Russians will look to move and push the front line all the way towards Hostre in the west, along Maximilianivka, and then onwards to the next line of defense, where the Russians will look to gain control over the entire open fields south of Netailove and north of Krasnohorivka all the way to Maximilianivka. So this entire area the Russians will look to gain control of following the capture of the city, which is now very close with the recent advances of the Russians. Throughout this month, they've managed to capture this amount of territory all the way to the northwestern outskirts, and it will likely end with this month being completely under Russian control, with only the suburbs outside of the city itself remaining under Ukrainian control. In the Avdiivka section of the front line, the Russians have advanced further in the direction of Vesele and have managed to capture the eastern parts of Vovche. The Ukrainian fortified positions here along the eastern parts of the river line are now completely under Russian control, as well as Vovche, and this has allowed the Russians to capture the Ukrainian forest line here south of Vovche, strengthening their positions ahead of Vesele. This will allow the Russians to push further southwestwards along the rail lines in the direction of Vesele, where they've managed to take control over the southern parts of the fortified position, connecting between the east of Vesele to Ivanivka in the central parts. At the same time, we see that there's pressure going on to the south of Vovche in the direction of the Ukrainian fortified positions there. So we see that the current fighting is now focused around the Ukrainian fortified positions south of Vovche, along the railways here from Pokrovsk down to Serhivka and Shelane, in the direction of Vesele itself, along the fortified position towards Ivanivka, the same with the west of Losovatsky in the direction of Ivanivka, Lysishne and Timofeivka, where they are pushing along the Ukrainian fortified position. It is unclear exactly what sort of fortified positions, but based on it, it is very clear that these are a mix of trenches that are located mostly along the forest areas. These are likely trenches and trench systems, while the ones in more open areas are likely dragon teeth and similar fortified positions that prevent Russian advances. Therefore, the Russian capture of this area isn't that they have managed to capture a trench that is connected to Ivanivka, but likely an obstacle preventing armored vehicles from pushing through. This means that the Russian advance is likely based on infantry, as it is also along the railways. To explain the importance of the Russians advancing along the railways rather than anywhere else, we can take a look at the topographic map for once. That is here in the direction of Vesele. The Russian positions along the railways are located at a height of about 215 meters. In some areas it goes up to 220 meters, but along the rail lines it's somewhere around 215 meters. And the direction of Vesele, for example, 180 meters. Here by Serhivka, it's about 199 meters. In the south, it goes all the way down to 180 meters. So there's a height advantage with the railway itself being built on the heights in the area, and this continues all throughout from Avdiivka along Ocheretine through the railways and all the way to Pokrovsk. It is always on the high ground. This is why the Russians are using the railways as the main direction in which they are advancing from. While taking a look from Google Earth, we can tilt the map a bit and we can see that on top of the fact that there is this height advantage, we also see that the railways are covered with forest areas in both directions. This provides good cover for the infantry moving along the railways, and it is also connected to forest lines that goes here in the direction of Vesele, for example. They can go and move along the railways and then use the forest line between the railways and Vesele to attack Vesele, and this is how they manage to enter and get a foothold in the eastern outskirts of the village. And the same further south, if they move along the railways, they can eventually branch out in these forest lines to advance the next areas. So in this section of the front line, the number one priority of the Russians is to gain a good position along the railways, which will then allow the Russians to branch out and attack the different villages in the areas, whether it is Vesele, Serivka, Selane, Vovche, Pokrovsk, Ivanivka, and so on. All of them are connected by forest lines that are connected by the railways, which is located on the high ground. Therefore, the capture of Ocheretine really was the one thing that completely switched the situation around here in the west and northwest of Avdiivka, and it was the biggest accomplishment of the Russian armed forces following the capture of Avdiivka itself in this section of the front line, and will only be comparable to a Russian capture of Novhorodivka, which is the final bastion of Ukrainian defenses ahead of Pokrovsk. Taking a look at the usual map, we see that Novhorodivka has multiple fortified positions. It has this fortified line all around the eastern parts of it, and there's this fortified position south of Horodivka, just east of it, and north of Mykolaiivka there's also fortified positions. West of Mykolaiivka there are fortified positions going all the way down south to Selidove and north to Novhorodivka. So the position here along Novhorodivka is the final defensive line of the Ukrainian positions. That is a significant outpost, and the capture of this town would mark the start of the Battle of Pokrovsk. We can also see that the distance to Novhorodivka along the railways from the Russian positions is about 9.4 kilometers, and if we take all the way down to Pokrovsk, it is slightly longer than that distance. But if we take a direct look between the Russian positions and Pokrovsk, it is about a 19.6 kilometers. So Novhorodivka is somewhere at the middle. The exact middle is somewhere around Mykolaiivka, which is again a different area where the Russians are going to be facing off against Ukrainian fortified positions. So we see that there are 3 fortified positions or outposts or bases, military positions that the Ukrainians use to defend ahead of Pokrovsk. This is Hrodivka to the north, Novhorodivka to the south, and Selidove further south. So these 3 areas are the bastions of Ukraine's defenses east of Pokrovsk. The capture of either of these 3 fortified positions by the Russians would mark a significant degradation of the Ukrainian defensive capabilities by Pokrovsk, and either of them would mark the start of the Battle of Pokrovsk. Following these 3 defensive positions, there's this line of defense ahead of Pokrovsk, and then there's the final line of defense just outside the city. To explain the importance of Pokrovsk, Pokrovsk is a central supply hub for the Ukrainians for any supplies going from Zaporizhia towards the Donetsk region and from Dnipro going to the Donetsk region, connected to Konstantinivka and Kramatorsk, Droshivka, Slovyansk, and so on. The only other supply line comes through from Kharkiv in the north, which can be used as a railway line. This allows for supplies to go into the Donetsk region. Other than that, there's only trucks that goes through the rear, through Dobropilya. This means that it would significantly limit the supplies going through from the Dnieper River to the Donetsk region, and will concentrate most of the supplies going from the north. At the same time, there is this connection going through from smaller roads to Dobropilia, but they will not be able to sustain the same amount of supplies as the highways west of Pokrovsk allow. At the same time, it will also limit the connection between the Donetsk region from the south, the areas here along Volodar, with the areas to the north along Kramatorsk, Konstantinivka, Sloviansk, and so on. So we see it will be a massive detriment to the Ukrainian defensive positions in the Donetsk region. It will be similar to the Russians capturing something like Droshkivka here to the north, capturing a position that will cut off the direct connection between Kramatorsk and Konstantinivka, forcing them to go an additional route around and significantly limiting and slowing down the supply between the two sides. That is the significance of Pokrovsk. It will limit this entire supply going into the Donetsk region and will limit the Ukrainian capacity and capability to send large groupings of forces here in the Donetsk region. It would not be an exaggeration to say that a Russian capture of Pokrovsk would spell the beginning of the end of the Battle of the Donetsk region in its entirety. Finally, in today's updates, we have two additional advances by the Russians, one in the north of Immovable along the Serbets River line towards the northern bank of it. This goes from the southeast of Berestove, west of Novoselivske. So following the Russian capture of Berestove and then pushes towards Peshane, the Russians also exited their positions here to the southeast of Berestove, west of Novoselivske, where they're now pushing along to the northern bank of the river line. This is to avoid a river crossing here by Stelmahivka and flank them from the rear. And at the same time, this has cut off the Ukrainian positions east of the river line, as Russians have positions east of Stelmahivka, and now the river line has been cut. This means that any Ukrainian supply or retreat out of the river line here by Novoselivske would have to go through the river line and a river crossing, and therefore Russian troops are able to hit them while they are vulnerable. So this is an improvement of the Russian positions in the area. At the same time, along Peshane, the Russians have started an attack towards the Ukrainian fortified positions north of Peshane, located at the heights, giving the Ukrainians a significant advantage here in the Peshane direction. And this also means that the Russians are moving to secure their current push towards the Oskar River line by pushing the northern direction and likely also in the southern direction to gain control over the fortified positions ahead of pushing onwards to push towards the Oskar River line towards the end of the road. So we see the offensive operations by the Oskar River line are entering a new stage where the Russians are looking to gain control over Stelmahivka and then launching offensive operations towards the Oskar River line. At the same time, there were reports that the Russians were gathering troops and preparing for an offensive in the direction of Borova a couple of weeks ago. Based on that, it could be a general offensive operations by the Russians here from Peshane in the north to Borova in the south, which would cut off the connection between Kupiansk and Liman in the south, and will also isolate Kupiansk completely from any other position east of the Oskar River line. Based on all of this, we see that the Russians are preparing additional offensive operations this summer, where they may look to significantly improve or even capture the entirety of the eastern bank of the Oskar River line in the Luhansk-Kharkiv region. At the same time, we also see pushes towards Pokrovsk, Krasnohorivka, following that towards Korahove, Selidove, and in the north towards Konstantinivka, gaining control over Chasiv and Siversk as well. So all of the main areas in the Donetsk region, as well as to the north of it, are currently under attack by the Russians as they look to gain full control over the areas and gain full control over the Donetsk region. And the current situation just points towards the Ukrainians having a very difficult time across the front line as Russians continuously advance. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.